I was present for the moment our world ceased to matter, though no one announced it as such. There were no alarms at first, no screaming crowds or orbital fire. Just a room too clean for grief and too quiet for hope. Deep in the administratum annex, where the walls sweated recycled air and the lights hummed with exhausted patience, I stood behind a brass rail with a dozen other functionaries, all of us summoned by stamped order, all of us pretending we did not know why. The astropath's final transmission lay on the slate, table like a corpse prepared for burial, neatly aligned, annotated, waiting. The clerks moved with ritual precision. Their robes were grey with rank stripes faded from decades of laundering, their faces pale from lumen, light and obedience. Servo quills hovered at their shoulders, insectile and whispering, scratching symbols into parchment grown from vat skin. I remember the sound more than anything else, the soft, relentless scrape of quill on page, like rats gnawing through bone. Each stroke was a confirmation, a cross-reference, a death disguised as diligence. They spoke in murmured catechisms of procedure, voices calm, almost kind, as if soothing a frightened child. Transmission verified. Authority acknowledged. Asset reallocation approved. When the astropath himself was wheeled past, I could not meet his eyes. They were bandaged, of course, white cloth stained yellow with oils and faintly pink with old blood. His mouth moved soundlessly, lips still shaping words meant for a void that had already turned away. The final message had burned him hollow, they said, searing his mind as payment for one last scream into the immaterium. Whatever he had felt in that moment, terror, betrayal, relief, it was already irrelevant. The message was received. The response had been silence, formalized and filed. I watched as the parchment was stamped. Once, twice, 3 times. Each seal pressed down with a dull, meaty thud, embossing sigils that meant closure, reassignment, acceptable loss. Triple, signed by hands that had never known our streets or breathed our air. The document slid into a waiting data coffer with the soft finality of a coffin lid. That was it. No speech, no prayer. The world reduced to a line item balanced against supply routes and projected casualties elsewhere. I felt something tear loose inside my chest then, not violently, but cleanly, like fabric cut by a sharp blade. They dismissed us with practiced sympathy. One clerk even inclined his head to me, eyes soft, voice warm. "You have done your duty," he said, as if duty were a blanket that could keep us warm in the dark to come. I wanted to scream at him, to grab his immaculate sleeves and demand he look at me, really look, but my mouth stayed shut. Years of compliance held it closed. I bowed, as instructed, and turned away. Outside, the spaceport chapel was already full. Word travels faster than orders ever admit, especially when it is bad. The air was thick with incense, burned in obscene quantities to sanctify what everyone already knew was damnation. It clung to the back of my throat, sweet and cloying, barely masking the harsher smells beneath panic sweat, unwashed bodies, leaking promethium from overworked generators. Candles guttered in long rows, their flames trembling as if afraid. People knelt shoulder to shoulder, pressing prayers into the stone with bleeding foreheads. I stood at the back, watching families cling together, watching workers in oil-stained coveralls mouth litanies they barely remembered. The priests spoke of vigilance and faith, of the emperor's ineffable will, but their voices wavered despite their training. I saw one old cleric's hands shaking as he raised the aquila, knuckles white, eyes darting toward the vaulted ceiling as if expecting it to crack open. No miracles came, only the distant roar of engines. When the last sanctioned ship lifted, the entire chapel seemed to exhale as one. We spilled out onto the observation causeway, boots clanging on metal grates worn smooth by generations of departures. The void ship rose on pillars of fire, its hull gleaming gold in the reflected light, every inch of it screaming authority and escape. I felt the heat wash over my face, drying the tears I had not noticed falling. For a heartbeat, the sky was radiant, almost holy. Then the ship broke atmosphere. The light faded. The engines dwindled to a whisper, and then to nothing at all. The sky above us bruised, clouds closing like old wounds, the color draining into sickly purples and grays. The void swallowed our last connection without ceremony. Around me, someone sobbed. Someone else laughed, high and hysterical. I could not move. My legs felt bolted to the deck, as if the planet itself were gripping me. unwilling to let go even as it was condemned. In that moment, clarity settled over me like ash. I understood that abandonment was not fire from the heavens or monsters in the streets, not yet. It was a sequence of approvals, a series of stamps, a process followed correctly. Somewhere, far away, a ledger had been balanced, and we were the excess trimmed away. There would be no recall, no sudden reprieve. The Imperium had not forgotten us by accident. It had let us go on purpose. I turned back toward the hive, toward the endless corridors and blocks stacked like coffins. The sirens were silent. The lights still burned. Everything looked the same. And that was the most terrifying part of all. The first thing that changed was the sound, not the big sounds, the thrum of the hive's arterial engines, the distant hammering of manufacturing presses, the ceaseless cough of ventilation fans dragging stale air through kilometers of ductwork. Those continued, because machines do not grieve. It was the smaller, human noises that went missing, one by one. As if someone had reached into the city and pinched the throat of its soul. The warning klaxons had wailed for most of my life. Every citizen learns their language before they learn their letters: amber for ration delays, red for riot protocol, black for void shield instability. Even in sleep, those sirens lived behind my eyes, a constant reminder that we were always one error away from punishment. On the day after the last ship departed, the klaxon sounded once, long, mournful, almost theatrical, then cut out mid-note. At first, we thought it was a power fault. People stood in corridors and craned their necks toward ceiling speakers, waiting for the familiar follow-up tone, the official voice that would tell us what shape our fear should take. Nothing came. The silence that followed was not peace. It was pressure. It pressed against the eardrums, against the teeth, against the inside of the skull. I remember swallowing and hearing my own throat click, too loud, indecent. The hive had been gagged. I went to work because the habit of obedience is stronger than panic. My assignment, clerk adjunct, grade 17, was to report to a mid-level annex beneath the transit causeway, where we processed shipment manifests, labor quotas, and maintenance petitions that rarely received answers even when the world was still supported. I wore my identification chit on a chain at my throat. Its edges were worn from my fingers rubbing it when I needed reassurance that I still existed. The hallway to the annex smelled of damp stone and electrical insulation. Lumen strips flickered overhead with that familiar weak yellow, making every face look ill. Citizens moved in lines without being told, shuffling toward their posts as if following a script they could not stop reciting. No one spoke above a whisper. We were afraid to disturb the quiet, as though noise itself might summon consequences. At the first Vox station I passed, the public broadcast was still playing. It was the same message I heard in the chapel after the ship's ascent. Calm, genderless machine perfect. Maintain productivity. Remain at assigned stations. Await further instruction. The voice repeated every 5 minutes, no variation, no updates, no acknowledgement that the world had changed. A few people stood beneath the speaker, staring upward with their mouths slightly open, as if expecting the metal grill to spit out a new command. A child asked his mother when the instruction would arrive. The mother slapped him hard enough that the sound echoed. "Do not question," she hissed, eyes wide with terror not of him, but of whoever might be listening. The child cried silently, pressing his palm to his cheek. Even pain had become quiet. In the annex, the clerks were already seated. Rows of hunched backs in grey robes, fingers stained with ink and machine oil, eyes red from sleeplessness. The air was hot with human breath and the faint chemical sting of vellum preservative. Servo skulls drifted above the easels, their optics blinking, their Vox grills clicking softly as they recorded attendance. Our supervisor, a man with a wax-sealed augmetic jaw and a devotional brand on his forehead, stood before us with a sheaf of printed directives. He looked smaller than he had the day before, as if something inside him had deflated. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "By the authority of the administratum," he began, voice strained, "all departments are to continue standard operations until relieved by new orders." A rustle ran through the room. Not protest, never protest, but the sound of bodies shifting, of lungs tightening. Someone in the back made the sign of the aquila over their chest, too fast, like swatting an insect. One of the older clerks raised a trembling hand. "Supervisor," she said, her voice a rasp from years of dust and prayer, "the void ships, there are no more." The supervisor's augmetic jaw clicked. He stared at her as though she had spoken blasphemy. "There will be further instruction," he repeated slower, as if the words themselves were armor. "Until then we work." And so we worked. We stamped papers that no longer mattered. We sorted petitions that would never be approved. We updated census tallies for labor sectors that were already collapsing. I remember the feel of the stamp handle beneath my palm, polished wood, worn smooth by thousands of repetitions, and the smell of the inky sharp, metallic, fatally sweet. Each document I marked felt like a betrayal. It was as if we were politely participating in our own erasure. At midday, I took my sanctioned break and walked to the ration concourse out of a need to see other faces, to confirm that reality still included people. The ration lines were longer than usual, but they were orderly. That, more than anything, told me how deep the Imperium's chains ran. Citizens stood shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering lumen globes, clutching stamped chits in dirty hands. Some held them like relics, kissing the paper edges between murmured prayers. Others stared forward with hollow eyes, lips moving as they silently recited their identification numbers. As if afraid their names would be stolen, the air in the concourse was thick with the smell of boiled nutrient paste, recycled sweat, and disinfectant sprayed too liberally to hide the rot beneath. A servo dispenser hissed and clanked, extruding grey blocks onto metal trays with an indifferent rhythm. Every few minutes, a cogitator chimed and a mechanized arm stamped a chit. "Approved, approved, approved." A man ahead of me turned and whispered, "Do you think they'll come back?" I should have reported him for unauthorized speculation. That was the law. The law was all we had left. My tongue felt heavy in my mouth. "Await further instruction," I said automatically, and hated myself for it. His eyes searched my face for something human. He found only my fear. He nodded, as if I had confirmed his worst suspicion, and turned away. It was then that the enforcers arrived. They came in a wedge formation, black armor scuffed, visors opaque, regulation batons clipped to their belts. Their boots struck the concourse floor in sharp, synchronized impacts that cut through the murmurs like gunshots. Behind them floated a picked recorder drone, its lens swiveling, its red light blinking steadily as it documented compliance. Their captain, if that is what he was, raised a vox hailer. "Maintain line discipline," he barked. "Unauthorized congregation will be punished. All ration disputes will be resolved according to code." The code. Always the code. The words were familiar enough to comfort some, and I saw shoulders relax, saw spines straighten, as if the presence of authority could replace the presence of rescue. It did not last. A woman near the front began to cry, quietly at first, then louder as the sound broke out of her like sickness. She clutched a chit that had been stamped deferred, the red ink glaring against the paper. "My children," she said, voice cracking. "They haven't eaten in." The captain struck her without hesitation. The baton met her jaw with a wet crunch. She collapsed, hands still clutching the worthless chit, blood darkening the floor. No one moved to help. We all stared straight ahead, because looking too long was invitation. The enforcers dragged her aside like refuse, leaving a smear behind that the disinfectant could not mask. Order was maintained. But I watched the enforcers' eyes, those hidden eyes behind dark visors, tilt upward, toward the concourse's cracked skylight, where the hive's upper levels vanished into gloom. It was a subtle motion, almost involuntary. A creature listening for thunder. They were waiting too. Later, as I returned to the annex, I passed the central transit hub. The great doors were open, but no trains came. The platform lights flickered, and the rails below were dark with oil and stagnant runoff. Citizens stood there anyway, rows of them, facing the tunnel mouths as if sheer insistence could summon transport. A Vox speaker repeated the same calm directive: maintain productivity. Await further instruction, and the words echoed down the empty tunnels until they sounded like mockery. On a wall nearby, someone had chalked a crude symbol, a circle with an X through it, not a holy sign, not an approved icon, a child's drawing maybe, or a heretic's mark. Beneath it, in shaky letters, one word: ELFT. I felt my stomach twist. My hands went cold. My first instinct was to scrub it away, to erase it before an enforcer saw and decided the entire corridor required purging. But my second instinct, quieter, more honest, was to stare at it until my eyes burned, because it was the only truthful thing I had seen all day, that evening. The lumen grids dimmed earlier than usual. The hive entered its night cycle reluctantly, lights fading to conserve power the central cogitators no longer predicted would be replenished. In my hab cell, the air tasted metallic and stale. The walls sweated condensation. Somewhere above me, pipes knocked in irregular rhythm, like a weak heartbeat. I sat on my cot with my ration block in my lap and could not bring myself to eat it. The nutrient paste smelled like wet paper and old bones. I listened to the hive's machinery grind on, and to the absence of sirens, no alarms, no new orders. Only the same message, looping faintly from a distant Vox station. As if the planet itself had become a broken recording, I pressed my forehead to the cold wall and whispered my confession into the damp concrete. Because there was no priest near enough to hear it, and no God near enough to answer, I confessed that I was afraid, not of invasion, not of monsters, not even of death. I was afraid of the quiet. The quiet that meant no one was coming. The quiet that felt like being buried alive under layers of procedure. And in the deepest part of that night, I realized something else, something heavier. The Imperium had not simply taken its ships and left. It had taken the sound of its attention with it. It had withdrawn the gaze that kept us in line. We were still caged, but the jailer had walked away, and we were left alone with our hunger and our rules. It is strange, the way people react when they are no longer watched. Some freeze. Some pray harder. Some begin to imagine they might become something other than obedient. And some, too many, begin to sharpen knives. Hunger does not arrive all at once. That is the first lie people tell when they remember it later, assuming it must have crashed over us like a riot or an invasion. It did not. Hunger seeped in through the cracks of routine, thin as recycled air, patient as paperwork. It arrived measured, sanctioned, and stamped. The food vaults were sealed 3 days after the sirens fell silent. There was no announcement, no sermon, just a revision to the ration codes, updated quietly in the cogitators and disseminated through the same Vox loop that told us to remain productive. The nutrient blocks grew smaller. Their color shifted from a tolerable gray to a yellowed paste shot through with darker flecks that clung to the teeth. The smell changed too, less sterile, more organic, like boiled leather. Some said it was an efficiency measure. Others whispered about alternative sourcing, though no one said that phrase loudly at first. I was reassigned to inventory duty on the 7th day. The order came down with the same dull authority as all the others. Clerk, Adjunct Malik, grade 17, reassigned to nutrient accounting subsection Delta, no explanation, no option to refuse. I packed my slate and seal, hands trembling despite myself, and followed the hab, guides down into levels I had only ever seen referenced in footnotes. The food vaults were sacred places in their own way. Thick doors of ceramite and steel, embossed with warning sigils and purity seals layered so thick they looked like scabbed flesh. Armed enforcers stood watch, their armor scratched and dulled, their patience thinner by the hour. Before I was allowed inside, I was scanned, stamped, and prayed over by a junior adept who smelled strongly of incense and fear. He pressed his thumb to my forehead, leaving a greasy Aquila mark behind. For accountability, he murmured, as if accountability could ward off starvation. Inside, the air was cold and dry, preserved to slow decay. Rows upon rows of stacked crates disappeared into the gloom, each marked with production dates, batch numbers, and devotional codes. Servo lifters hummed softly as they glided along rails, moving pallets with mechanical reverence. The smell hit me hardest, not rot, not yet, but a dense, oily tang that reminded me of slaughterhouses I had once audited from a distance. Fat and preservatives. Protein rendered down until it barely remembered its source. My task was simple. That was how it was described, at least. I was to count, to tally, to mark daily shrinkage against projected consumption curves and flag irregularities. I sat at a metal desk bolted to the floor, slate before me, stylus heavy in my hand. Ink stained my fingers almost immediately, seeping into the cracks of my skin, no matter how often I wiped them on my robes. The numbers did not lie. They never do each day. The totals dipped lower than they should have. Not catastrophically, not enough to trigger emergency protocol, but consistently like a slow hemorrhage. The cogitator suggested variants due to spoilage, spillage, transit inefficiencies. I knew better. Everyone did. The hive was eating itself, one unauthorized mouthful at a time. At first, the thefts were small. A missing crate here, a broken seal there. We logged them, filed reports, forwarded them up the chain that no longer reached anywhere. Enforcers conducted spot checks, beating confessions out of dock workers and loaders whose ribs stuck out like scaffolding. Punishments were swift and exemplary. Bodies were displayed at the concourse entrances with placards listing their crimes in neat, block letters. TFT off I Empire Parapart Y. The words did not mention hunger. People learned quickly what could be said and what could not. Smiles became survival tools. In the ration lines, citizens smiled at the enforcers, at the dispensers, at each other. They smiled while their stomachs cramped and their vision blurred. Hunger, after all, was a private failing. Dissent was a public one. The underhive was the first to change. Reports began to come in, maintenance crews refusing assignments, corpse grinder output dropping below acceptable thresholds. At first the explanations were mechanical, grinder malfunctions, transit delays, power fluctuations. But the air down there grew thick with a different smell, one that crept upward through the vents and refused to be scrubbed out. Sweet rot. Copper. Cooked meat. I tried not to think about it. I told myself my duty was numbers, not speculation. Still, when the first audit request crossed my desk marked irregular protein sources, my stylus slipped, dragging a black line across the slate like a wound. The term was clean, clinical. It sat there on the page, sanitized by syllables. Irregular protein sources. It could have meant vermin, recycled waste, algae vats grown in unauthorized spaces. I prayed it meant anything but what my gut already knew. I was ordered to accompany an inspection team. We descended by cargo lift, the cage rattling and groaning as it sank into the hive's lower strata. The lumen lights flickered and failed entirely halfway down, replaced by emergency strips that cast everything in corpse blue. The enforcers with us tightened their grips on their batons. One of them muttered a prayer I did not recognize. The doors opened onto a corridor that had once been a residential thoroughfare. Hab units lined the walls, their doors hanging open or torn away entirely. The floor was slick, not with blood. There wasn't that much left, but with grease and waste. The smell was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste. My eyes watered, my stomach twisted, empty and aching. We found the remains in a communal kitchen. Pots still sat on heat rings, their contents congealed into grey-brown sludge. Bones, human bones, were stacked neatly in a corner, scraped clean with careful efficiency. Someone had even sorted them by size. Femurs together, ribs together, skulls placed respectfully on a shelf, facing outward like icons. I do not remember vomiting. I remember the sound my mouth made when it opened, a thin, animal noise that embarrassed me even as it escaped. One of the enforcers struck me hard across the back, not out of cruelty but reflex. "Control yourself," he snapped. "This is evidence." The residents were gone, taken by hunger, by enforcers, or by something worse. It did not matter. The report was written. The term irregular protein sources was expanded into subcategories and recommendations. Increased patrols, stricter corpse management, revised grinder quotas. That night, back at my desk, I updated the tallies. The numbers improved slightly after the crackdown. Consumption stabilized. The cogitator purred its approval. Somewhere, someone might have looked at that data and nodded, reassured that the system was correcting itself. I stared at my stained fingers and thought of the bones stacked so neatly, of the care taken even in desperation. People had not become monsters. They had become efficient. The Imperium had trained us well. Sleep became difficult after that. When I closed my eyes, I dreamed of inventories that breathed, of crates that whispered my name. I dreamed of teeth scraping bone in careful, reverent motions. I woke with my mouth watering and my stomach twisting, ashamed of the thought that flickered through my mind before I could crush it. Protein is protein. In the ration lines, rumors spread faster now. People spoke of special distributions, in certain sectors of stew that tasted almost like meat, of children growing stronger while others withered. Smiles grew sharper. Eyes lingered too long on neighbors' arms, on the curve of a calf, on the hollow beneath a collarbone. The corpse grinders resumed operation, but they ran hotter than before, overworked and under-maintained. The ash they produced was darker, heavier. It clung to everything. When it fell from the vents like grey snow, people brushed it from their clothes and wondered, silently, whose prayers they were wearing. I continued to count, to mark shrinkage, to flag anomalies. Each mark I made felt like another confession, another small betrayal recorded in ink. I told myself that if I stopped, someone worse would take my place. Someone who would not hesitate. Someone who would make the numbers cleaner. That was how hunger won, not by breaking us, but by making us complicit. By the end of the second week, the phrase irregular protein sources no longer made my hand shake. That frightened me more than anything else. It meant the planet was teaching me how to survive it. And the lessons were only beginning. The order to return to the manufactorum came wrapped in the language of salvation. Full output mandated. Resource relevance under review. Demonstrate continued utility. Those words appeared on every Vox station, every public slate, every lumen, wall that still functioned. They were repeated by priests and overseers alike, spoken with the fervor of men who needed to believe that obedience could still earn reprieve. If we proved our worth, if we bled enough labor into the machines, the Imperium might remember us. That was the promise. That was the lie. I had not worked the manufactorum floors since my youth, before my wrists grew soft and my back learned the posture of a desk. But clerks were reassigned like spare parts now, and I found myself issued a faded coverall, a respirator with cracked seals, and a stamped chit declaring me temporarily essential. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth. The manufactorum was a cathedral of noise. As I stepped through its blast doors, the sound hit me like a physical force, presses slamming, pistons cycling, conveyor belts screaming under loads they were never meant to bear. The air vibrated constantly, a low, teeth, rattling hum that made thought difficult and prayer impossible. Overhead, lumen arrays flickered in jaundiced rhythm, casting everything in sickly yellow light that flattened faces into skull masks. Shadows jumped and crawled, cast by swinging chains and dangling cables like gallows. The smell was worse than I remembered. Hot metal and machine oil, yes, but layered beneath it was human waste, sweat, and the faint copper tang of blood. The floor was slick in places, stained dark where accidents had been washed away with solvent and indifference. Warning sigils were everywhere, peeling and ignored, their red paint dulled by grime and time. I was assigned to line 17, a munitions assembly line that had been running without pause since the abandonment. Shell casings clattered past on a belt, their brass skins still warm to the touch. My job was simple: inspect, stamp, pass along. If a casing failed tolerance, I was to drop it into the reject chute and log the loss. Efficiency above all things. The workers beside me barely looked human anymore. Men and women, hard to tell which beneath layers of filth and augmetic braces, moved with jerky, repetitive motions, their bodies locked into rhythms dictated by machines. Some had metal collars bolted around their necks, shock cables trailing back to control nodes monitored by overseers in elevated walkways. Others wore prayer tags nailed directly into their flesh, devotional strips fluttering uselessly in the heat. Their eyes haunted me most. Sunken, glassy, unfocused. They did not look at the shells they handled. They did not look at each other. They stared through the line, through the wall, through the future. Hunger hollowed them out, leaving only reflex and obedience behind. The overseers stalked above us like carrion birds. They wore cleaner uniforms, reinforced boots, and carried shock malls tuned to maximum compliance. Every so often, one would strike a worker who lagged or faltered, not out of cruelty, though there was that, but to remind the rest of us that pain was still cheaper than replacement. Their vox casters barked productivity metrics and devotional slogans in equal measure. Work is worship, output is loyalty. It was only a matter of hours before the first body fell. He was an older man, his augmetic arm sparking where insulation had worn through. He stumbled, missed a casing, and the belt dragged him forward. There was a shout, more reflex than alarm, and then the press came down. The sound was like wet cloth tearing. When the machine lifted again, there was less of him than before. The line did not stop. A servitor trundled forward almost immediately, its lobotomized face slack, its clawed hands efficient. It scraped the remains into a waste cart and sprayed the floor with disinfectant that smelled faintly of almonds. The overseer logged the incident with a few curt words and waved us on. Production quotas could not tolerate sentiment. I stood there, my stamp hovering uselessly above the next casing, and felt something inside me fracture. Not snap, snap implies drama, but crack, like a hairline fault spreading quietly through stone. This was not an accident. It was consumption. The manufacturer was not merely using its workers, it was eating them. As shifts stretched longer, the bodies came faster, collapse from exhaustion. Hands caught in gears, lungs filled with fumes, each time. The response was the same: removal, replacement, record. New workers were pulled from the hab blocks, from ration lines, from anywhere flesh could be found. The term voluntary replacement appeared on the lists posted at shift's end, but the signatures were all the same, shaking, smeared. Pressed by hands that knew refusal meant starvation, I was ordered to help process the lists. At the end of each cycle, I sat at a side desk with other clerks, stamping names beneath pre-written declarations of service. People lined up before us, eyes darting, mouths dry. Some whispered prayers as they signed. Others bit their lips until blood ran, sealing the parchment with red thumbprints because they could not hold the stylus steady. One woman collapsed at my feet after signing. She did not scream. She simply folded, her body done. The enforcers dragged her away, and her name was circled in red on my slate, deferred, to be reassigned. I knew what that meant. I stamped it anyway. The servitors disturbed me more with each passing hour. They moved tirelessly, hauling, lifting, welding, their augmetic limbs wearing softly beneath the din. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of what they had once been, human features stretched and mutilated, eyes glazed with chemical obedience. One servitor paused beside me as I worked, its breath wheezing through a grill where a mouth had been. For a terrible moment, I thought it recognized me, that somewhere inside its ruined skull, a fragment of self screamed. Then an overseer struck it, resetting its routine, and it lumbered on. Food breaks were abolished on the third day of full output. Inefficient, the directive said. Nutrient paste was piped directly into dispensers along the line, extruded into workers' mouths as they labored. The paste was thinner now, darker. It tasted wrong. I swallowed it anyway, my stomach clawing for anything it could get. I began to see the connection clearly then, the one the ledgers hid behind euphemism and code. The manufacturer consumed workers. The corpse grinders consumed bodies. The food vaults consumed the output. It was a closed system, elegant in its cruelty. The planet was feeding itself to itself in hopes of being deemed worthy of notice again. At the end of my fourth shift, I stood on a gantry overlooking line 17 and watched as a man deliberately stepped into the path of the press. There was no hesitation, no struggle, just a tired acceptance. The machine came down. The line surged on. The overseer swore, furious, not at the death, but at the delay. "That's the third today," he snarled. "Log him as equipment interference." I logged it, that night when I returned to my hab cell. I scrubbed my hands until the skin cracked and bled, but the smell of oil and meat clung to me. I lay on my cot listening to the distant thunder of presses that never slept, and I understood something with a cold, nauseating clarity. The Imperium had abandoned us, yes, but the machines had not. They would keep demanding, keep consuming, keep grinding us down into useful shapes until there was nothing left but slag and statistics. And we, desperate to be seen as relevant, would feed ourselves into their mouths willingly, stamping our own consent with shaking hands. This was not survival. This was digestion. When the machines failed to save us, we turned, inevitably, desperately, to faith. The shrines had always been full, of course. In a hive like ours, prayer was as common as breathing recycled air. You prayed before work so the machines would not maim you. You prayed after work so they had not. Faith was a maintenance ritual, a lubricant applied to the soul to keep it from seizing under pressure. But after abandonment, prayer ceased to be routine. It became frantic. The first shrine I returned to was the one nearest my hab block, a narrow chamber wedged between a transit stairwell and a coolant conduit. I had passed it 1,000 times without entering, offering only a cursory sign of the Aquila as I hurried by. Now its doors stood open day and night, the threshold worn smooth by knees and foreheads. Candles burned low and guttered constantly, their smoke staining the ceiling black. The air inside was so thick with incense that it felt chewy, each breath a struggle. I knelt with the others, my joints aching, my stomach gnawing itself raw. The stone beneath my knees was cold and damp, leaching heat from my bones. Somewhere behind the altar, pipes knocked irregularly, and the sound blended with whispered litanies, until it was impossible to tell where machinery ended and prayer began. The icon at the shrine's heart was ancient and damaged. The emperor's face, if it could still be called that, was cracked, one eye missing entirely, the other reduced to a dark hollow where gold leaf had flaked away. Soot and candle, smoke had blurred the features into something stern and distant. I stared at it until my vision swam, waiting for some flicker of recognition. Nothing came. Around me people confessed aloud. They whispered sins like bribes, listing failures and impure thoughts, as if volume might increase their chances of being heard. A man beside me sobbed as he admitted he had stolen a ration chit from his sister. A woman pressed her face to the floor and begged forgiveness for eating meat she did not want to identify. The words tangled in the incense, rising toward the ceiling and going nowhere. The priests encouraged it. They moved through the crowds in threadbare robes, swinging censers with exaggerated vigor, layering prayer upon prayer until the very air seemed to choke on syllables. Their voices were hoarse from constant recitation, but they did not stop. They could not stop. To stop would be to admit the truth, that they were speaking into a void as empty as the sky above our world. I recognized one of them, a senior cleric who had once lectured on the virtue of patience during ration shortages years before. His beard was untrimmed now, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. When he preached, his words came faster than his breath could support. "This is a trial," he intoned, voice cracking. "A purification. The emperor tests those he loves most severely." Someone shouted from the back, "Then why did he leave?" The sound froze the shrine, every head turned. Enforcers were not present, perhaps even they were praying elsewhere, but the habit of fear remained. The cleric's mouth opened and closed soundlessly for a moment. Sweat ran down his temples. Finally he said, "Faith does not require understanding." It was not an answer, it was paperwork. Confessionals overflowed in the days that followed. People queued for hours to speak into Vox, grilles wired to nothing more than recording slates, pouring out their souls in the hope that the act itself might count as submission. I heard voices rise and fall, break and harden. I heard the same fears repeated endlessly: hunger, abandonment, the terror of becoming something unforgivable in order to survive. When it was my turn, I knelt alone in a narrow booth that smelled of old wax and mold. The grill before me was cracked, its edges sharp. I placed my mouth close and spoke softly, because even now I feared being overheard. "I do not know how to be loyal anymore," I confessed. "I obey, I work, I count, but I do not feel seen, I do not feel chosen, I feel processed." Silence answered me, not even the hiss of a recording slate. Just the distant grind of the hive, and the faint echo of someone else's sobs bleeding through the walls. I left the booth feeling lighter and more ashamed at the same time. I had wanted absolution. What I had received was confirmation that absolution required an audience, and ours had departed. As conditions worsened, the liturgies intensified, shrines stayed open around the clock. Processions wound through hab, levels and manufactorum corridors, chanting hymns that echoed off steel walls and rattled loose dust from the ceilings. People flogged themselves in public, blood spotting the floor, convinced that visible suffering might attract divine attention. Children were made to kneel for hours, their small voices reciting catechisms until they slurred with exhaustion. I attended a mass held in a converted transit hub, thousands packed together beneath a flickering holo icon. The priest at the center preached with manic energy, his words tumbling over one another. "We must prove worthy," he cried. "We must show that we endure, that we do not falter when tested." I looked around at the crowd, at the hollow cheeks, the bandaged limbs, the vacant eyes. If this was endurance, it felt indistinguishable from slow execution. Even the clergy began to change. Their sermons grew sharper, more accusatory. They spoke of hidden heresies, of impurity weakening the planet's spiritual signal. They encouraged denunciation as devotion, urging the faithful to report doubt wherever it appeared. Faith became another ledger, another quota to be met. If salvation did not arrive, then someone must be to blame. I saw priests argue among themselves in low, furious voices, accusing one another of doctrinal deviation. I saw one dragged from the altar by enforcers after his homily strayed too close to despair. The crowd watched in silence as he was beaten and hauled away, and then they resumed praying harder than before. I returned to the shrine one final time after a shift in the manufactorum left my hands shaking too badly to stamp anything. My knees split when I knelt, skin tearing open on the stone. I did not feel it. Pain had become distant, a background noise like machinery. I looked up at the damaged icon and felt something inside me finally give way. Not faith. Faith had been gone for some time, though I had pretended otherwise. What broke was hope, the childish notion that someone somewhere was still monitoring us with concern rather than calculation. I understood then that the shrines were not places of communion. They were waiting rooms for an office that had closed. I pressed my forehead to the stone and whispered a prayer anyway, because habit is hard to kill. Not for rescue, not for forgiveness, just for the strength to endure what was coming without becoming unrecognizable to myself. The icon did not answer. The candles burned down to stubs. And outside the shrine, the hive continued to grind, indifferent to prayer, consuming the faithful as efficiently as the faithless. Order did not collapse when it finally broke. That is another lie told by those who imagine chaos as fire and screaming and banners torn down in the streets. What happened instead was quieter, colder, and far more deliberate. Order fractured, yes, but along pre-approved fault lines, doctrine against doctrine, hunger against hunger, loyalty sharpened into a blade and handed to those desperate enough to use it. The emergency proclamation came through the Vox at the start of the third week. By necessity of planetary stability, emergency compliance statute is enacted. All citizens are required to assist in identifying morale saboteurs, resource deviants, and doctrinal threats. Cooperation will be rewarded. Failure will be corrected. The message repeated every 10 minutes, its tone unchanged, its words sinking deeper each time they were heard. The phrase morale saboteur became the most dangerous classification on the planet because it could mean anything. Doubt, hoarding, silence at the wrong moment, bread in excess of allocation. The enforcers changed after that. They no longer patrolled in small units. They moved in squads, supported by data, adepts, and picked recorders, their armor newly adorned with purity seals and devotional slogans hastily stamped and slapped on without care. Their batons were replaced or supplemented by execution pistols. Their orders were broader now, less constrained by procedure and more by quotas. Arrest numbers were posted publicly. At first they were framed as successes, X morale threats neutralized, Y units of stability restored. People nodded, reassured by the familiar comfort of numbers. Then the lists grew longer. Names appeared, neighbors, co-workers, priests. Sometimes entire HAB levels were listed as under review. The air grew tight with unspoken calculations. Who is next? Who will I name before I am named? I was summoned to assist with tribunal documentation. The chambers were set up in a repurposed archive hall, its towering shelves of records now serving as walls for makeshift courtrooms. The smell there was unforgettable: old paper, ink, fear, and ozone from overworked cogitators. Rows of benches held the accused, their hands bound with plastic ties, their faces drawn tight. Above them hung banners declaring loyalty is life in bold, flaking letters. The tribunals were swift. An enforcer read the charges. A data adept summarized evidence. Often nothing more than a neighbor's testimony or a flagged ration discrepancy. The accused was permitted to speak, technically, though interruptions were frequent and encouraged. Then the verdict was rendered: guilty, always guilty. My role was to record, to timestamp, to ensure the execution logs were updated with tidy efficiency. I sat at a desk near the front, stylus moving automatically, my stomach hollow and churning. Each name I wrote felt heavier than the last, as if the slate itself were sinking under the weight of them. I watched a man beg. He was middle-aged, a transit worker by the look of his hands, palms calloused and cracked. He swore he had only taken extra rations because his wife was ill. He produced a medical chit, stamped and signed. The enforcer barely glanced at it before discarding it onto the floor. Ordering undermines morale. The presiding officer intoned. Undermined morale threatens stability. Threats to stability must be removed. The man screamed when they dragged him away, not because he was being executed. He understood that part, but because his wife was still waiting for him somewhere, counting the minutes until he returned with food. I recorded his execution as corrective action. Outside the tribunals, denunciation became currency. Posters went up encouraging vigilance. Vox announcements praised citizens who came forward with information. Rewards were promised: additional ration credits, reassignment away from high-risk labor, sometimes even a private audience with a priest to receive special blessings. Hunger made excellent leverage. Neighbors began to watch each other too closely. Conversations died mid-sentence when footsteps approached. Children were taught to report incorrect speech, the same way they were taught catechisms. I saw a woman dragged from her hab because her own son had repeated something she said in a moment of exhaustion. What if no one is listening anymore? The boy received extra rations that week. I received my first denunciation request shortly after. A data adept approached my desk with a slate and a polite, strained smile. "Your proximity to inventory and tribunal records grants you insight," she said carefully. "We are compiling a list of individuals whose attitudes may require review. Your cooperation would be noted." The slate glowed softly, blank and expectant. I thought of the manufacturing worker who stepped into the press, of the bones stacked neatly in the underhive, of the shrines filled with unanswered prayers. I thought of how tired everyone looked, and how easily tiredness could be mistaken for treason. I wrote a name. I do not know if the person survived. I did not check. That was how survival worked now. You did not follow up. You did not ask. You accepted the reward, 2 extra ration credits stamped into my account, and you lived with the taste of it in your mouth. Others were less restrained. Old grudges resurfaced, now dressed in the language of loyalty. Entire families were erased based on whispered accusations. The tribunals ran day and night, their cogitators overheating, their execution pits filling faster than corpse grinders could process. Ash fell thicker from the vents, darker than before. The priests adapted quickly. They preached that denunciation was a sacred duty, that exposing weakness purified the body of the faithful. They blessed enforcer batons and execution pistols, anointing them with oils meant for relics. Faith and fear braided together until they were indistinguishable. I began to notice the change in myself then. I flinched less at screams. I wrote faster. I started to recognize the signs of someone about to be accused and felt relief when it was not me. Each day, I told myself I had no choice. Each day, that justification felt thinner. One evening, as I left the tribunal hall, I saw a familiar face among the accused, a clerk from my old annex. She had once shared recaf with me during a night shift, complaining quietly about cramped hab, space and unreliable lifts. Now she knelt with her hands bound, eyes searching the room desperately. She saw me, our gazes locked for a heartbeat. Recognition flared in her eyes, followed by hope. She opened her mouth to speak my name. I looked away. The execution log was updated 15 minutes later. When I returned to my hab that night, I found a new notice slipped under my door. Commendation for civic vigilance. My ration allocation had been increased again, just enough to keep me functional, just enough to keep me complicit. The planet's abandonment had not united us against a common fate. It had turned us inward, sharpened us against one another. We had become both prisoners and wardens, feeding the system with our fear and our betrayals. In the absence of an external enemy, we had become the enemy we understood best. And somewhere, deep in the hive, something laughed. Or perhaps that was just the sound of machinery grinding bone into something useful. The sky changed first. Not suddenly, nothing ever happened suddenly anymore, but with a wrongness that crept in at the edges of perception. I noticed it on my way back from a tribunal shift, neck aching, eyes raw from lumen glare. The upper transit concourse had a cracked viewport, a rare glimpse of the heavens through layers of void, glass and grime. I had passed it 100 times without looking up. This time, something pulled my gaze. The clouds were moving against the wind, slow, dragging motions, like bruises being pressed and released beneath skin. Static crawled across the glass in pale blue veins, making my teeth itch. The stars beyond looked dimmer than they should have, as if someone had turned them down out of disinterest rather than mercy. I stood there too long enough for an enforcer to bark at me to keep moving. When I tore my eyes away, I felt as though I had just watched something avert its gaze. That night, the storms began. They were not like the seasonal ash falls we were accustomed to, nor the acid rains that sometimes scarred the lower levels clean. These storms screamed. The wind howled through the hive's superstructure with a pitch that set nerves on edge, carrying with it ash so fine it slipped through seals and filters alike. Every surface grew gritty. Every breath tasted burnt. Lightning split the clouds, but it did not illuminate, it revealed. For fractions of a second, the hive's spires stood stark against the sky, jagged and skeletal, like exposed ribs. I thought I saw shapes moving in the flashes, silhouettes too large and wrong to be aircraft. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself many things by then. Power failures cascaded through entire districts. The lumen grids flickered, went dark, and stayed dark. Emergency systems failed to engage in places, or engaged and never shut off in others, bathing corridors in harsh red light that made bloodstains indistinguishable from shadows. Vox traffic devolved into static and overlapping screams as relays shorted out, messages cut off mid-prayer, mid-order, mid-breath. The official explanation came. Eventually atmospheric interference. Maintain shelter. Maintain faith. It did nothing to explain why the void above felt closer, heavier, like a lid being slowly pressed down. When my hab level lost power entirely, the darkness felt alive. Without the constant hum of machinery, every sound became intrusive, breathing, shuffling feet, distant impacts reverberating through the hive's bones. People gathered in corridors out of instinct, clutching candles and glow rods, whispering rumors that grew wilder with each retelling. Raiders, plague, ships, punishment, tests. I volunteered for the generator shrine convoy because it was safer than staying still. That is the lie I told myself. The truth was that movement felt like purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping me upright. The shrine was said to house an auxiliary power core, ancient, unreliable, but better than nothing. If we could restart it, an entire sector might regain light. That mattered. Or at least it used to. We set out in a column of 20, escorted by 6 enforcers whose armor was already streaked with ash. Our glow rods cast weak cones of light that barely pierced the gloom. Every step crunched underfoot, ash mixing with old debris and newer remains. The air was bitterly cold now, the storm siphoning heat away as efficiently as hope. The first bodies appeared 3 levels down. They were posed, not sprawled, huddled against walls, seated on steps, hands folded in laps, faces frozen in expressions of waiting. No wounds, no obvious cause of death, just people who had sat down and never stood up again. Hunger, cold, or despair. It was hard to tell anymore. We stepped around them carefully, as if noise or disrespect might wake them. At one junction, a Vox speaker crackled to life without warning. For a heartbeat, relief surged through me. Then the sound resolved into a loop of overlapping messages, prayers, evacuation orders, screams, static, all layered together, playing at once, endlessly. One of the enforcers smashed the unit with his baton. The sudden silence felt obscene. As we descended further, the storm's voice changed. It was no longer just wind. There were impacts now, dull, distant booms that traveled through the hive's frame and into our bones. Not bombardment, I realized. Something else. Something striking the upper levels with careless force, like debris thrown by a bored giant. Each impact sent showers of dust and rust raining down, forcing us to cover our heads and wait it out. Someone behind me whispered, "They've found us." No one asked who they were. The generator shrine loomed out of the darkness at last, a squat structure of reinforced stone and steel, its doors marked with faded devotional script. Half the iconography had been torn away, either scavenged or destroyed in anger. We forced the doors open and spilled inside, coughing as stale air rushed out to meet us. The interior was a mess. Cables lay ripped from their housings. Control panels were smashed, their guts exposed. Candles burned in strange places, melted wax pooling over cogitator keys. Someone had tried to pray the machine back to life. Someone else had tried to dismantle it for parts. Both had failed. The tech adept with us, thin, shaking, eyes darting constantly, set to work anyway, muttering binaric prayers under his breath. We waited in the darkness, weapons raised, listening to the storm batter the shrine's walls. That was when the lights went out completely, not just our glow rods, not just the shrine. Everything. The storm seemed to inhale, and the world went black. In that absolute darkness, I felt something shift. A pressure behind the eyes, a sense of being observed, not by anything with intent or malice, but by something vast and indifferent that had finally noticed an error in its peripheral vision. Then the lights came back, briefly. Through the shrine's viewport, the sky was visible, torn open by lightning. For an instant, I saw it clearly. The stars were gone. Not obscured, gone. In their place was a vast, churning emptiness, like a wound that refused to close. The void was not dark, it was wrong, a color my mind could not hold on to. Someone screamed a prayer. Someone else fired their weapon into the ceiling. The enforcers shouted orders that dissolved into panic. The lights died again, and this time they did not return. The tech adept sobbed. "The core's dead," he whispered, "burned out. It's like it was drained." We did not argue. There was nothing left to do but retreat. The return was worse. Sections of the hive had collapsed under the storm's assault, forcing us to detour through unfamiliar corridors. The ash was thicker now, clinging to skin and lungs alike. One of the civilians slipped and vanished into a maintenance shaft before anyone could grab him. We did not stop. We could not afford to. When we reached the upper levels, we found entire districts gone dark and silent. No candles, no voices, just empty corridors and more bodies in waiting poses. Vox messages played from damaged units, repeating the same last words over and over. Like broken minds trapped in metal, I realized then what abandonment truly meant. It was not just being left behind. It was being erased slowly, methodically, while still conscious enough to understand it. The Imperium had withdrawn its protection, yes, but now even the universe seemed to be losing interest. The sky itself had forgotten us. When I finally reached my hab cell, I did not sleep. I sat on my cot in the dark, listening to the storm rage and the hive creak under the strain. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the feeling remained that we were no longer enclosed, no longer hidden. We had been noticed, and whatever noticed us did not care enough to hurry. In the end, it was paperwork that survived us, not walls, not prayers, not even the machines, many of which finally ground themselves into useless ruin when there was no one left to feed them parts or flesh. What endured, what always endures, were the records, data slates sealed in vacuum cases, ledgers etched onto plasteel sheets, archives buried so deep in the hive's bones that even the storms could not quite reach them. I became their caretaker by default. There were no reassignment orders this time, no Vox announcement. The tribunal halls emptied one night and never refilled. The enforcers stopped coming to their posts. Some fled, some starved, some joined whatever it was that now prowled the upper levels when the storms peaked. I do not know, because by then I had learned the most important survival skill of all: do not look unless you must. I returned to the central archive, because it was familiar, because familiarity felt like safety even when it clearly was not. The lumen strips still worked there, dim but steady, powered by a failing auxiliary grid that whined like a dying animal. The air was dry and smelled of dust, old ink, and machine oil. It felt like a tomb that had been expecting me. The census directive was already waiting. It sat on my desk, printed and stamped, as if it had been issued years ago and simply delayed by circumstance. Final population accounting. Purpose closure. That word, closure, mocked me with its neatness. Closure implied something had ended cleanly. Nothing about our world had been clean for a very long time. I sat down and began to count. There were no door-to-door surveys anymore, no ration line tallies, no work shift attendance sheets. I worked from absence, from silence, from sectors that had stopped generating any data at all. Entire hab levels marked non-responsive. Manufacturum lines listed as terminated. Shrine attendance reduced to 0, then struck from the record entirely. Each adjustment required justification. Each justification required a code. I entered them mechanically, fingers moving out of habit even as my mind drifted farther away from my body. Presumed deceased, unrecoverable, lost to environmental failure. The language was bloodless, perfect. It reduced screaming, starving lives to administrative inevitabilities. I was thorough. I always had been. When I reached my own sector, my stylus hovered. For a moment, just one, I considered marking myself as deceased. It would have been neat, symmetrical. A clerk disappearing into his own ledger, devoured by the same process he had served. The thought almost comforted me. Instead, I marked myself as active. Someone had to finish the work. The final defense failure was not dramatic. There was no last stand worthy of song. No coordinated resistance. Just a series of breaches reported by automated systems that no longer expected responses. Void shield harmonics collapsed in the upper atmosphere. Atmospheric processors failed one by one, their alarms chiming uselessly into the dark. Something, raiders, plague, or entities I had no words for, entered the hive, and found very little resistance waiting. I felt it mostly through vibrations, distant impacts, structural groans traveling through kilometers of steel and stone. The archive lights flickered but held. I continued to work as dust drifted down from the ceiling and settled on my sleeves like ash. Somewhere far above, something roared, not in triumph, but in irritation, as if annoyed that the meal was already spoiled. When the last external sensor went dead, the cogitator chimed softly and displayed a final notice: planetary status none, compliant. Asset recovery abandoned twice then, thoroughly. I finished the census an hour later. I counted the living like defective components, units still operating below acceptable parameters, slated for inevitable failure. I counted the dead like surplus inventory, already written off. When the final number resolved on the slate, it felt unreal in its smallness. A planet reduced to a rounding error. I saved the file in triplicate, because procedure demanded it, and because some part of me still believed in the ritual. I sealed it, stamped it, and placed it in a data coffer marked for later review. The irony did not escape me. There would be no later, no reviewer. Just this quiet, airtight box drifting through time until entropy or scavengers claimed it. Before I closed the coffer, I added one more file. This one was not authorized, not formatted correctly, just a personal log, recorded in my own shaking hand. I did not dress it up in codes or euphemisms. I wrote plainly, brutally. Because no one was left to punish me for it, I wrote about the day the sky bruised. About the bones stacked neatly in kitchens. About the woman in the ration line and the clerk who tried to say my name. About how easy it was to betray someone for 2 extra credits when the alternative was watching your hands shake too badly to hold a stamp. I wrote that abandonment was not an explosion, not a horror from the void, but a sequence of correct decisions made far away by people who would never smell what we smelled or hear what we heard. I wrote that the Imperium did not hate us. It simply did not consider us worth the ink required to save. When I finished, my hands were numb. I sealed the confession and slid it into the coffer with the census. I told myself one last foolish time that maybe someone would find it. Some distant archivist, flipping through recovered data centuries from now, pausing at an anomaly. Feeling, perhaps, a flicker of discomfort before filing it away again. That was my last act of rebellion, to hope for discomfort. I returned to my hab cell afterward, stepping carefully around debris and bodies that had not yet been stripped. The storms had passed, leaving behind a cold, unnatural stillness. The sky beyond the viewport was a flat, starless gray, like an unpainted wall. Whatever had noticed us had already moved on. I sat on my cot and waited, not for rescue, not for death, though I knew it would come. I waited for the planet to finish forgetting me, the way a body forgets a limb it has already lost. My hunger had dulled into something distant. My fear had burned itself out. All that remained was a strange, heavy calm. I had served. I had obeyed. I had recorded. In the end, I became what the Imperium always promised I was, a number in a dead archive, accurate to the last digit, filed correctly, and never read.